Okay, if anyone's got headphones in, this is your warning. I'm going to ring some bells. This is one of the bells that I brought back with me from my holidays. My great grandmother Mary collected bells, and her daughter, my grandmother, kept them in her home for many years. And I was recently asked if I would like them. And they all have, as you can hear, very different tones. And this one aesthetically is my favorite. Very ornate here. If you look very closely, there's some sort of face. I don't know anything about these bells, where they came from. As I said, this is my favorite in terms of look. And this might be my favorite sound. This one's also a bottle opener, if you look closely there. And so there are, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. And there was also a cowbell, but I didn't bring that with me at this moment here. So there's a little bit of, what do they call it? Bell ASMR. Hope that's all very soothing to everyone except for the school bell. The school bell is not very soothing at all. But putting the bells aside, I thought I would have a bookish essay for you today from a book that I picked up while I was down in New York on my holidays. This is a book from 1922. It's a collection of essays about reading and experience with literature and books. And it's in a larger collection titled Confessions of a Book Lover by Maurice-Francis-Egan. Old paper label here that's kind of aged and faded, but I'm just happy it's there. And unfortunately there isn't a replacement in the back of the book as you sometimes see. And we have this great title page here, Doubleday, Page and Company, Garden City, New York, 1922. And I'm going to read to you the very first chapter or essay in this collection, titled My Boyhood Reading. And there's been many authors who have written about their childhood reading, and I always enjoy reading about people's first experiences with books. And so that's why I'm bringing you the first chapter here. And I will note that this book, this collection, is dedicated to Theodore Roosevelt, a man of action in love with books. And that's in memory of him. So here we go. Chapter 1, My Boyhood Reading, Early Recollections. To get the best out of books, I am convinced that you must begin to love these perennial friends very early in life. It is the only way to know all their curves, all those little shadows of expression and small lights. There is a glamour which you never see if you begin to read with a serious intention late in life, when questions of technique and grammar and mere words begin to seem too important. Then you have become too critical to feel through all Fenimore Cooper's verbiage the real lakes and woods, or the wild fervor of romance beneath dear Sir Walter's mat of words. You lose the unreclaimable flavor of books. A friend you may irretrievably lose when you lose a friend, if you are so deadly unfortunate as to lose a friend, for even the memories of him are embittered. But no great author can ever have done anything that will make the book you love less precious to you. The new school of pedagogical thought disapproves, I know, of miscellaneous reading, and no modern moralist will agree with Madame de Seven that bad books are better than no books at all. Madame de Seven may have meant books written in a bad style, or feeble books, and not books bad in the moral sense. However, I must confess that when I was young, I read several books which I was told afterward were very bad indeed. But I did not find this out until somebody told me. The youthful mind must possess something of the quality attributed to a duck's back. I recall that once the Confessions of Rousseau was snatched suddenly away from me by a careful mother, just as I had begun to think that Rousseau was a very interesting man, and almost as queer as some of the people I knew. I believe that if I had been allowed to finish the book, it would have become, by some mental chemical process, a very edifying criticism of life. Tom Jones I found in an attic, and I was allowed to read it by a pious aunt whom I was visiting because she mixed it up with Tom Brown of Rugby, but I found it even more tiresome than Eric or Little by Little, for which I dropped it. I remember, too, that I was rather shocked by some things written in the Old Testament, and I retorted to my aunt's pronouncement that she considered the Arabian Nights a dangerous book by saying that the Old Testament was the worst book I had ever read. But I supposed people had put something into it when God wasn't looking. She sent me home. At home, I was permitted to read only the New Testament. On winter Sunday afternoons, when there was nothing else to do, I became sincerely attached to the Acts of the Apostles, and I came to the conclusion that nobody could tell a short story as well as our Lord himself. The centurion was one of my favorite characters. He seemed to be such a good soldier, and his plea, "Lord, I am not worthy," flashes across my mental vision every day of my life. In the Catholic churches, a part of the gospel is read every Sunday and carefully interpreted. This always interested me because I knew in advance what the priest was going to read. Most of the children of my acquaintance were taught their scriptures through the international Sunday school lessons, and seemed to me to be submerged in the geography of Palestine and other tiresome details. For me, reading as I did the whole of the New Testament was radiant with interest, a frankly human interest. There were many passages that I did not pretend to understand, sometimes because the English was obscure or archaic, and sometimes because my mind was not equal to it or my knowledge too small. Whatever may be the opinion of other people, mine is that the reading of the New Testament in the simplicity of childhood, with the flower of intuition not yet blighted, is one of the most beautiful of mental experiences. In my own case, it gave a glow to life. It caused me to distinguish between truth and fairy tales, between fact and fiction, and this is often very difficult for an imaginative child. This kind of reading implies leisure and the absence of distraction. Unhappily, much leisure does not seem to be left for the modern child. The unhappy creature is even told that there will be something in heaven for children to do. As to distractions, the modern child is surrounded by them, and it appears to be one of the main intentions of the present system of instruction not to leave a child any moments of leisure for the indulgence of the imagination. But I am not offering the example of my childhood for imitation by modern parents. Nevertheless, it had great consolations. There were no movies in those days, and the theater was only occasionally permitted, but on long afternoons, after you had learned to read, you might lose yourself in the Scottish chiefs to your heart's content. It seemed to me that the beauty of this fashion of leisurely reading was that you had time to visualize everything, and you felt the dramatic moment so keenly that a sense of unreality never obtruded itself at the wrong time. It was not necessary for you to be told that Helen Mar was beautiful. It was only necessary for her to say in tones so entrancing that you heard them, "My Wallace," to know that she was the loveliest person in all Scotland. But the Scottish chiefs required the leisure of long holiday afternoons, especially as the copy I read had been so misused that I had to spend precious half-hours in putting the pages together. It was worth the trouble, however. Before I could read, I was compelled on rainy days to sit on my mother's knee and listen to what she read. I am happy to say that she never read children's books. Nothing was ever adapted to my youthful misunderstanding. She read aloud what she liked to read, and she never considered whether I liked it or not. It was a method of discipline. At first I looked drearily out at the soggy city street, in which rivulets of melted snow made any exercise suitable to my age impossible. There is nothing so hopeless for a child as an afternoon in a city when the heavy snow begins to melt. My mother, however, was altogether, regardless of what happened outside of the house. At 2:00 precisely, after the manner of the king in William Morris's Earthly Paradise, she waved her wand. After that, all that I was expected to do was make no noise. In this way I became acquainted with the Virginians, then running in Harper's Magazine with Adam Bede, and As You Like It, and Richard III, and Oliver Twist, and Nicholas Nickleby, and Valentine Fox, Why Valentine Fox? In other volumes, when I should have been listening to Alice in Wonderland. But when I came in turn to Alice in Wonderland, I found Alice's rather dull in comparison with the adventures of the Warrington brothers, and Thackeray's picture of Gumbo carrying in the soup tureen. To have listened to Rebecca's description of the great fight in Ivanhoe, to have lived through the tournament of Ashby de la Zouche, it was a poor preparation for the vagaries of the queer creatures that surrounded the inimitable Alice. There appeared to be no children's books in the library to which we had access. It never seemed to me that Robinson Crusoe or Gulliver's Travels or Swiss Family Robinson were children's books. They were not so treated by my mother, and I remember, as a small boy, going up to the Chestnut Street in Philadelphia with divine eagerness to buy the latest number of a Dickens serial. I think the name of the shop of Paradise, which sold these books, was called Ashburnham's. It may be asked how the episode in Adam Bede of Hetty and of that little Emily in Dickens struck the child mind. As I remember, the child mind was awed and impressed by a sense of horror, probably occasioned as much by the force of the style, by the suggestions of an unknown terror, as by any facts which a child could grasp. It was a curious thing that my mother, who had remarkably good taste in literature, admired Mrs. Henry Wood extravagantly. She also admired Queen Victoria. She never read East Lynne aloud because, I gathered, she considered it improper, and Miss Brandon's Lady Audley's Secret came under the same ban, though I heard it talked of frequently. It was difficult to discover where my mother drew the line between what was proper and what was not proper. Shakespeare she seemed to regard as eminently proper, and I noticed, hesitated and mumbled only when she came to certain parts of Ophelia's song. It seems strange now that I ever rated Mrs. Henry Wood's novels with those of George Eliot or Thackeray or Dickens. There seemed to be some imperceptible difference which my mother never explained, but which I instinctively understood. And when Anthony Trollope's Orley Farm was read, I placed him above Mrs. Henry Wood, but not on an equality with Dickens or Thackeray. Harper's Magazine in those days contained great treasure. There, for instance, were the delightful articles by Port Crayon, as I'm knocking bells over, Porte Crayon, General Strothers, I think. These one listened to with pleasure, but the bane of my existence was Mr. Abbott's Life of Napoleon Bonaparte. It seemed to me as if it would never end, and it stretched as dolorously before me as that other fearful process which appalled my waking days, the knowledge that all my life I should be obliged to clean my teeth 3 times a day with powdered charcoal. And I'm sure that changed for him at some point when modern toothpaste became popular as opposed to powdered charcoal. But continuing on. After a time I began to read for myself, but the delights of desultory reading were gloomed by the necessity of studying long lessons that no emancipated child of today would endure. Misguided people sometimes came to the school and told childish stories, at which we all laughed, but which even the most illiterate despised. To have known George Warrington, to have mingled familiarly in the society of George Washington, to remember the picture of Beatrix Esmond coming down the stairs, I am not speaking of Du Maurier's travesties of that delightful book, to have seen the old ladies in Cranford sucking their oranges in the privacies of their rooms, made one despise foolish little tales about over-industrious bees and robins, which seemed not even to have the ordinary common sense of geese. Suddenly my mother became a devout Catholic. The scene changed. On one unhappy Sunday afternoon, Monte Cristo was rudely snatched from my entranced hands. Dumas was on the list of the improper, and to this day I have never finished the episodes in which I was so deeply interested. Now the wagon of the circulating library ceased to come as in the old days. The children of the neighbors offered me Sunday school books, taken from the precious store of the Methodist Sunday school opposite our house. They seemed to me to be stupid beyond all words. There was not one really good fight in all of them, and after an honest villain like Brian de Bois Gobert, the bad people in these volumes were very lacking in stamina. The Rollo books were gay compared to them. I concluded that if anything on earth could make a child hate religion, it was the perusal of these unreal books. My mother saw that I had Alban Butler's Lives of the Saints for Sunday reading. They were equally dull, and other lives, highly recommended, were quite as uninspiring as the little volumes from the Protestant library. They were generally translated from the French, without vitality, and without any regard for the English idiom. I recall, through the mists, sitting down one Sunday afternoon to read the life of St. Rose of Lima, as it concerned itself with South America. It seemed to me that there might be in it a good fighter or two, or at least somebody might cut off the ear of a high priest's servant, as was done in the New Testament. But no, I was shocked to read in the very beginning that so pure was the little saint, even in her infancy, that when her uncle, who was her godfather, kissed her after her baptism, a rosy glow, a real blush of shame, overspread her countenance. In that book I read no more that day. But I have discovered a volume I have never forgotten, which, probably after the Young Marooners, had the greatest influence on me for a short period. That was Fabiola by Cardinal Wiseman. There was good stuff in it. It made me feel proud to be a Christian. It was full of thrills, and it taught a lot about archaeology of Rome, for it was part of that excellent story. I have always looked on Fabiola as a very great book. Then at Christmas, when my father gave me The Last Days of Pompeii, I was in a new world, not alien to the world of Fabiola, but in some way supplementary to it. This gift was accompanied by Washington Irving's Tales of Alhambra. What nice little storybooks arranged for the growing mind could awaken such visions of the past, such splendid aberisks and trailing clouds of glory as this book. Read at the right time, it makes the pomegranate and the glittering crescents live forever, and creates a love for Spain and a romance of old Spain which can never die. After this, I had a cold metal douche. I was given Les Enfants des Bois by Elie Berthet in French, to translate word for word. It was a horrible task, and the difficulties of the verbs and the laborious research in the dictionary prevented me from enjoying the adventures of these infants. I cannot remember anything that happened to them, but I know that the book gave me an ever-enduring distrust of the subjunctive mood in the Gaelic language. Somebody had left about a copy of a French romance called Les Adventures de Polydore Mareskin. It was of things that happened to a man in a kingdom of monkeys. It went very well with an occasional use of the dictionary, until I discovered that the gentleman was about to engage himself to a very attractive monkeyess. I gave up the book in disgust, but I have since discovered that there have been lately several imitators of the adventures, which I think were written by an author named Leon Goslin. About this time, the book auction became a fashion in Philadelphia. If your people had respect for art, they invariably subscribed to a publication called the Cosmopolitan Art Magazine, and you received a steel engraving of Shakespeare and his friends, with Sir Walter Raleigh very much in the foreground, wearing a beautifully puffed doublet and very well-fitting hose, and another steel engraving of Washington at Lexington. If your people were interested in literature, they frequented the book auctions. My father had a great respect for what he called classical literature. He considered Cooper's The Task immensely classical. It was beautifully bound, and he never read it. One day he secured a lovely edition of the complete works of Thomas More. It had been a subject of much competition at the auction, and was cherished accordingly. The binding was tooled. It was put on the center table and adored as a work of art. Here was richness. Tom Moore's long poems are no doubt classed at present as belonging in those old and faded gardens in which the daisy and the keepsake by Lady Blessington once flourished. But if I could only recall the pleasure I had in the reading of Lalla-Rookh and the Veiled Prophet of Khorassan, I think I should be very happy. And the notes of Lalla-Rookh and of Moore's prose novel, The Epicurean. The Epicurean was not much of a novel, but the notes were full of amazing Egyptian mysteries, which seemed quite as splendid as the machinery in the Arabian Nights. The notes to Lalla-Rookh smelled of roses, and I remember, as a labor of love, copying out all of the allusions to roses in these notes, with the intention of writing about them when I grew up. My mother objected to the translations from Anakora. She said they were improper. But my father said he had been assured, on competent authority, that they were classic, and of course that settled it. There was no story in them, and they seemed to me to be stupid. Just about this time, one of the book auctions yielded up a copy of the complete works of Miss Mitford. You perhaps can imagine how a city boy, who was allowed to spend 2 weeks each year at most on the arid New Jersey seacoast, fell upon our village. It became an incentive for long walks in the hope of finding some country lanes and something resembling the English primroses. I read and I reread Our Village until I could close my eyes at any time and see the little world in which Miss Mitford lived. I tried to read her tragedy, the Tu Foscari. A tragedy had a faint interest, but being exiled to the attic for some offense against the conventionalities demanded of a Philadelphia child, with no book but Miss Mitford's, I spent my time looking up all the references to roses in her tragedies. These I combined with the knowledge acquired from Tom Moore and made notes for a paper to be printed in some great periodical in the future. Why roses? Why Miss Mitford and roses? Why Tom Moore and roses? I do not know. But when I was 16 years of age, I printed the paper in Appleton's Journal, where it may still be found. My parents, who did not look on my literary attempts at the expense of mathematics with favor, suggested that I was a plagiarist. But as I had no time to look up the meaning of the word in the dictionary, I let it go. It simply struck me as one of those evidences of misunderstanding which every honest artist must be content to accept. My mother, evidently fearing the influence of classical literature, gave me one day The Parent's Assistant by Miss Edgeworth. I think that it was in this book that I discovered Rosamond, or the Purple Jar, and the story of the good boy or girl who never cut the bit of string that tied a package. I sedulously devoted myself to the imitation of this economic child, and was very highly praised for getting the best out of a good book until I broke a tooth in trying to undo a very tough knot. It was a far cry from the respectable Miss Edgeworth to a series of Beadle's dime novels. I looked on them as delectable but inferior. There was a prejudice against them in well-brought-up households. But if you thoughtfully provided yourself with a brown paper cover which concealed the flaring yellow of Beadle's front page, you were very likely to escape criticism. I never finished Osceola, the Seminole, because my aunt looked over my shoulder and read a rapturous account of a real fight in which somebody kicked somebody else violently in the abdomen. My aunt reported to my mother that the book was very indelicate, and after that Beadle's dime novels were absolutely forbidden. At school, we were told that any boy who read Beadle's was a moral leper, but as most of us concluded that leper had something to do with leaper, the effect was not very convincing. Perhaps I might have been decoyed back to Beadle's, for all the youngsters knew that there was nothing really wrong in them, but I happened to remember the scene in Sir Walter Scott's Abbot, where Edward Gleningdon wades into the sea to prevent Mary Stuart from leaving Scotland. I hied me to the monastery and devoured everything of Sir Walter's except St. Ronan's Well. That never seemed worthy of the great Sir Walter. The Black Dwarf and Anne of Gerenstein were rather tough reading, and Count Robert of Paris might have been written by Lord Bacon if Lord Bacon had been a contemporary of Sir Walter's. Peveril of the Peak and Ivanhoe and Bride of Lammermoor again and again dazzled and consoled me, until I discovered Nicholas Nickleby. Nicholas Nickleby took entire possession of me. In the rainy winter afternoons, when nothing could occur out of doors, which a respectable city boy was permitted to indulge in, I found that I was expected to work. Boys worked hard at their lessons in those days. There was a kitchen downstairs with a Dutch oven not used in the winter. There it was easy to build a small fire and to toast bread and to read Nicholas Nickleby, after one had rushed through the required tasks, which generally included 10 pages of Histoire Sacra in Latin. If you never read Nicholas Nickleby when you were young, you cannot possibly know the flavor of Dickens. You can't laugh now as you laughed then. Oh, the delight of Mr. Crumley's descriptions of his wife's dignified manner of standing with her head on a spear. The tragedy in Nicholas Nickleby never appealed to me. It was necessary to skip that. When the people were gentlemanly and ladylike, they became great bores. But what young reader of Dickens can forget the hostile attitude of Mr. Lillivick, great-uncle of little Miss Kenswigs, when Nicholas attempted to teach them French? As one grows older, even Mr. Squeers and Tilda give one less real delight. But think of the first discovery of them, and it is like Balboa's, or was it Cortez's, discovery of the Pacific in Keats' sonnet. Nicholas Nickleby was read over and over again with unfailing pleasure. I found Little Dorrit rather tiresome. Barnaby Rudge and A Tale of Two Cities seemed to be rather serious reading, not quite Dickensish enough for my taste, yet better than anything else that anybody had written. My later impressions of Dickens modified these instinctive intuitions. One day a set of Thackeray arrived, little green volumes as I remember, and I began to read Vanity Fair. My mother seized it and read it aloud again. Her confessor had told her that a dislike for good novels was Puritan, and she, shocked by the implied reproach, took again to novel reading. I am afraid that I disliked Colonel Dobbin and Amelia very much. Becky Sharp pleased me beyond words. I don't think that the morality of the case affected my point of view at all. I was delighted whenever Becky downed an enemy. They were such a lot of stupid people, the enemies, and I reflected during the course of the story that, after all, Thackeray had said that poor Becky had no mother to guide her footsteps. When the Marquis of Stein was hit on the forehead with the diamonds, I thought it served him right, but I was unhappy because poor Becky had lost the jewels. In finishing the book with those lovely Thackerayan cadences, my mother said severely, "That is what always happens to bad people." But in my heart I did not believe that Becky Sharp was a bad person at all. For a time I returned to Dickens, to Nicholas Nickleby, to David Copperfield. I respected Thackeray. He had gripped me in some way that I could not explain. But Dickens I loved. Later, it was on one June afternoon, I think, when the news of Dickens' death arrived, it seemed to me that for a while all delight in life had ended. One of those experts in psychology who are always seeking questions, some time ago wrote to me demanding if Plutarch's Lives had influenced me, and whether I thought they were good reading for the young. Our Plutarch was rather appalling to look at. It was bound in molted cardboard and the pages had red edges, but I attacked it one day when I was about 10 years of age and became enthralled. It was actual. My mother was a veteran politician and read a daily paper with Southern tendencies called The Age. My father belonged to the opposite party and admired Senator Hoare as greatly as my mother admired the famous Vallandigham. Between the two, I had formed a very poor opinion of American statesmen in general, but the statesmen in Plutarch were a very different type. Julius Caesar interested me, but Brutus filled me with exultation. I had not then read Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. It seemed to me that Brutus was a model for all time. Now, understand, I was a good Christian child, and I said my prayers every night and morning, but this did not prevent me from hating the big bully of the school who made the lives of the 10 or 15 small boys a perpetual torment. How we suffered, no adult human tongue can tell, and our tongues never told because it was convention that tales should not be told out of school. One of the pleasant tricks of the bully and his friends was to chase the little boys after school in the winter and bury them until they were almost suffocated in the snow which was piled up in the narrow streets. It was not only suffocating snow, but it was dirty snow. It happened that I had been presented with a penknife consisting of 2 rather leaden blades covered with a brilliant iridescent mother-of-pearl handle. The bully wanted this knife, and I knew it. Generally, I left it at home, but it occurred to me on one inspired morning, after I had read Plutarch the night before, that I would display the knife open in my pocket, and when he threw the full weight of his body upon me, I would kill him at once by an upward thrust of the knife. This struck me as a good deed entirely worthy of Brutus. Of course, I knew that I should be hanged, but then I expected the glory of making a last dying speech, and besides, the school would have a holiday. On the morning preceding the great sacrifice, I gave out dark hints to the small boys, distributed my various belongings to friends who were about to be bereaved, and predicted a coming holiday. I was looked on as rather crazy, but I reflected that I would soon be considered heroic, and my friends gladly accepted the gifts. The fatal afternoon came. I displayed the penknife, the chase began, the bully and his chosen friends threw themselves upon me. The moment had come. I thrust the knife upward. The big boy uttered a howl and ran, still howling. I looked for blood, but there was none visible. I came to the conclusion with satisfaction that he was bleeding internally. I spent a gloomy evening at home, uttering dire predictions which were incomprehensible to the members of my family, and reread Brutus in the Lives. The next morning I went to school with lessons unstudied and awaited events. The mother of the bully appeared and entered into an excited colloquy with the very placid and dignified teacher. I announced to the boy next to me, "My time has come." I was called up to the awful desk. "Is he dead?" I asked. "Did he bleed internally?" "You little wretch," the mother of the tyrant said. "You cut such fearful holes in my son's coat that he is afraid to come to school today." Then I said regretfully, "Oh, I hoped that I had killed him." There was a sensation. My character was blackened. I was set down as a victim of total depravity. I endured it all, but I knew in my heart that it was Plutarch. This is the effect that Plutarch had on the mind of a good Christian child. The effects of Plutarch on my character were never discovered at home, and as I grew older and learned one or two wrestling tricks, the bully let me alone. Besides, my murderous intention, which had leaked out, gave me such a reputation that I became a dictator myself, and made terms for the small boys in the name of freedom, which were sometimes rather despotic. It was also during these days that I remember carrying confusion into the family, when a patronizing intellectual lady called and said, "I hope that this dear little boy is reading the Rollo books." "No," I answered quickly and indiscreetly. "I am reading The New Magdalen by Wilkie Collins," and I did not think much of Wilkie Collins until I read The Moonstone. It seemed that The New Magdalen had been purchased inadvertently by my father in a packet of classics. My father generally arrived at home late in the afternoon when he read the evening paper. After a very high tea, he stretched himself on a long horsehair-covered sofa and bade me read to him, generally from the novels of George Eliot, or from certain romances running through the New York Ledger by Sylvanus Cobb, Jr. These were generally stories of the times of the Irish kings, in which gallows glasses and lovely and aristocratic Celtic maidens disported themselves. My mother, after her conversion, disapproved of the New York Ledger. In fact, there were families in Philadelphia whose heads regarded it as a real horror. In our house, there was a large stock of this interesting periodical, which, with many volumes of Godey's Lady's Book, were packed in the attic. It happened that a young man in whom my father had a great interest was threatened with tuberculosis. An awful rumor was set abroad that he was about to die. He sent over a messenger asking my father for the back numbers of the New York Ledger, containing a long serial story by Mrs. Anakora Mowat. As I remember, it was a story of the French Revolution, and the last number that I was allowed to read ended with a description of a dance in an old chateau when the marquise, who was floating through the minuet, suddenly discovered blood on the white kid glove of her right hand. I was never permitted to discover where the blood came from. I should like to find out now if I could find the novel. I remember that my mother was terribly shocked when my father sent the numbers of the New York Ledger to the apparently dying man. "It's a horrible thing," my mother said, "to think of any Christian person reading the New York Ledger at the point of death." The young man, however, did not die, and I rather think my father attributed his recovery to the exhilarating effect of one of his favorite stories. There were certain other serial stories I was ordered to read. They were stories of the Irish Brigade in France. My mother, I remember, disapproved of them because Madame de Pompadour was frequently mentioned, and she thought that my father regarded the lady in question too tolerantly. These romances were, I think, written by a certain Miles O'Reilly, who was in some way connected with the army. This procedure of reading aloud was not always agreeable, as my father frequently went to sleep in the middle of a passage and forgot what I had already read. The consequence was that I was obliged to begin the same old story over again on the following evening. It happened that my father was one of the directors of a local library, and in it I found Bates' volume on the Amazon. I forget the exact title of the book. I found myself in a new world. I lived in Para. I tried to manufacture an imitation of urary poison with a view of exterminating rats in the warehouse by the use of arrows. I lived and had my being in the forests of Brazil, and I produced at intervals a thrilling novel with a glowing atmosphere of the Amazon as a background. I preferred Mr. Bates to any novelist I had ever read. He held possession of my imagination until he was forced out by Mr. Jerningham, who wrote a most entrancing book on Brittany. St. Malo became the only town for me. I adored Henry de la Roche-Jacqueline and the Stuarts, whom I had learned to love at the knees of Sir Walter Scott. They were displaced by the Vendians. Noticing that I was devoted to books of travel, my father asked me to parse Kane's Arctic Voyages. I found the volumes cold and repellent. They gave me a rooted prejudice against the North Pole, which even the adventures of Dr. Cook has never enabled me to overcome. About this time, my mother began to feel that I needed to read something more gentle, which would root me more effectively in my religion. She began, I think, with Cardinal Newman's Callista, in which there was a thrilling chapter called The Possession of Juba. It seemed to me one of the most stirring things I had ever read. Then I was presented with Mrs. Sadlier's The Blakes and the Flanagans, which struck me as a very delightful satire, and with a really interesting novel of New York called Rosemary by Dr. J.V. Huntington, and then a terribly blood-curdling story of the Carbonari in Italy called Leonello. After this, I was wafted into a series of novels by Julia Kavanagh, Natalie, and Bessie, and 7 Years, I think, were the principals. My father declined to read them. He thought they were too sentimental, but as the author had an Irish name, he was inclined to regard them with tolerance. He thought I would be better employed in absorbing Tom and Jerry or The Adventures of Corath and Bob by Pierce-Egan. My mother objected to this and substituted Lady Violet or The Wonder of Kingswood Chase by the younger Pierce-Egan, which she considered more moral. My father was very generous at Christmas, and I bought a large volume of Froissart for $2.50 at an old book stand on Fifth Street near Spruce. After this, I was lost to the world during the Christmas holidays. After breakfast, I saturated myself with the delightful battles of that precious book. My principal duty was to look after the front pavement. In the spring and summer, it was carefully washed twice a week and reddened with some kind of paint, which always accompanied a box of fine white sand for the scouring of the marble steps. But in the winter, this respectable sidewalk had to be kept free from snow and ice. Hitherto, my battle with the elements had been rather a diversion. Besides, I was in competition with the other small boys in the block, or in the square, as we Philadelphians called it. Now it became irksome. I neglected to dig the ice from between the bricks. I skimped my cleaning of the gutter. I forgot to put on my gums. The boy next door became a mirror of virtue. He was quoted to me as one whose pavement was a model to all the neighbors. Indeed, it was rumored that the mayor, passing down our street, had stopped and admired the working of his civic spirit. Well, the result of my efforts was passed by with evident contempt. I did not care. I hugged Froissart to my heart. Who would condescend to wield a broom and a wooden shovel, even for the reward of 10 cents in cash, when he could throw javelins and break lances with the knights of the divine Froissart? The end of my freedom came after this. The terrible incident of the mayor's contempt, invented, I believe, by the boy next door, induced my mother to believe that I was not only losing my morals, but becoming too much of a bookworm. For many long weeks I was deprived of any amusing book, except Robinson Crusoe. After this interval, vacation came. I seemed to have grown older, and books were never quite the same again. In the vacation, however, when the days were very long, and there was a great deal of leisure, I found myself reduced to Grimm's fairy tales and a delightful volume by Madame Perrault, and I was even then very much struck by the difference. Of course, I read Grimm from cover to cover and went back again over the pages, hoping that I had neglected something. The homeliness of the stories touched me. It seemed to me that you found yourself in the atmosphere of old Germany. Madame Perrault was more delicate. Her fairy tales were pictures of no life that had ever existed, and there was a great dissimilarity between her Cendrillon and the grim story of Aschenputtel. As I remember, the haughty sisters in the story of the beautiful girl who lived among the ashes each cut off her toes in order to make her feet seem smaller, and left bloody marks on the glass slipper. Madame Perrault's slipper was, I think, of white fur, and there was no such brutality in her fairyland. But, except Hans Christian Andersen's, there are no such gripping fairy tales as those of the Brethren Grimm. During this vacation, too, I discovered the leprechaun, the little Irish fairy with the hammer. He was not at all like the English fairies in Shakespeare's Midsummer's Night Dream. And leaving out Ariel, I think I liked him best of all. That summer, too, I found an old copy of Midsummer Night's Dream in the attic. The print was exceedingly fine, but everything was there. No doubt there is much to be said by the pedagogues in favor of scrupulously studying Shakespeare's plays. But if you have ever discovered As You Like It or Midsummer Night's Dream when you were very young, you will never know the meaning of that light which never was on land or sea, and with which Keats surrounds us in the Ode to the Nightingale. The love interest did not count much. In my youthful experience, everybody either married or died in books. This was to be expected. It was the atmosphere that counted. One could see the troopers coming into the open space in the forest of Arden and hear their songs, making the leaves of the trees quiver before they appeared. And Puck and Caliban. When I was young, I was always very sorry for Caliban, and being very religious, I felt that the potent Prospero might have done something for his soul. There was a boy who lived near us called Lawrence Stockdale, peace be to his ashes wherever he rests. My father and mother, who were persons of cultivation, encouraged him to read, but we were not of one opinion on any subject. He was devoted to Dumas the elder. After the episode of Monte Cristo, I was led to believe that Dumas was wrong. I preferred Sir Walter Scott and loved all the Stuarts, having a positive devotion for Mary, Queen of Scots. One day, however, I discovered somewhere under a pile of old geometries and books about navigation a fat, red-bound copy of Boccaccio. Stockdale said that Boccaccio was wronger than Dumas, and that his people had warned him against the stories of this Italian. As we lived near an Italian colony, and he disliked Italians, while I loved them, I attributed this to mere prejudice. The Boccaccio was, as I have said, fat and large. For a boy who likes to read, a fat book is very tempting. And just as I had seated myself one afternoon on the front doorstep to read the story of the falcon, and having finished it with a great pleasure, dipped into another tale not so edifying, my mother appeared. She turned pale with horror and seized the book at once. My father was informed of what had occurred. He was a little alarmed, I think. My mother said, "We shall have to change the whole course of this boy's reading. We shall have to change the boy first," my father said with a sigh. But this was not the end. At the proper time I was led to the pastor, who was my mother's confessor. The book was presented to him for destruction. "It's a bad book," the monsieur said. "I hope you didn't talk about any of these stories to other boys in school." "Oh, no," I said. "If I did, they would say much worse things, and I would probably have to tell them in confession. Besides," I added, "all the people in the Boccaccio book were good Catholics, I suppose, as they were Italians, and I think, after all, when they caught the plague, they died good deaths." The pastor looked puzzled, took the book and gave me his blessing and dismissed me, and my mother seemed to think that I was sufficiently exorcised. After this, the books I read were more carefully considered. I was given the tales of Canon Schmidt, dear little stories of German children in the Black Forest, with strange little woodcuts, which went very well with another volume I found at this time, called Jack Halifax, not John Halifax, gentleman, which my mother had already read to me, but a curious little tome long out of print. And then there sailed upon my vision a long procession of the works of the Flemish novelist Hydric Conscience, whose Lion of Flanders opened a new world of romance, and there were Wooden Clara, and other pieces which made one feel as if one lived in Flanders. Just about this time, I read in Little's Living Age a novel called The Amber Witch, and some of Fritz Reuter's Low German stories, but these were all effaced by The Quaker Soldier. This may not have been much of a novel. I did not put it to the touch of comparison with The Virginians or Esmond. They were what my father called classics, things superior and apart, but The Quaker Soldier was quite good enough for me. It opened a new view of American Revolutionary history, and then it was redolent of the country of Pennsylvania. I recall now the incident of the Pennsylvania Dutch housewife's using her thumb to spread the butter on the bread for the hungry soldier. This is all that I can recall of those delectable pages. But later, neither Henry Peterson's Pemberton nor Dr. Weir Mitchell's Hugh Wynne seemed to have the glory and the fascination of the long-lost Quaker Soldier. After this, I fell under the spell of the French Revolution through a book given to me by my mother about La Vendée. It was a dull book, but nothing, not even a bad translation, could dim the heroism of Henry de la Roque-Jacquelin for me, and I became a royalist of the royalists, and held hotly the thesis that if George Washington had returned the compliment of going over to France in '89, he would have done Lafayette a great service by restoring the good Louis and the beautiful Marie Antoinette. When I had reached the age of 17, I had developed, as the result of my reading, a great belief in lost causes. I had become exceedingly devoted to the cause of Ireland, as the kindly pastor had sent me a copy of Willie Riley and his Colleen Bawn, perhaps as an antidote to the lingering effects of Boccaccio, and I was rather troubled to find so many swear words in it, but I made all the allowances that a real lover of literature is often compelled to make. And we are just over 46 minutes in here, and we still have quite a ways to go. So I will stop here for now and come back later with the next section. We are pausing on page 37 here before he begins to talk about his reading of the Bible once again. So I hope you've been enjoying this, and I will see you again soon with the remainder of my Boyhood reading.